Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here and to be part of this symposium on such an important topic facing households, businesses, and really civil society at large. Thank you very much to AfriSACA, AfriBusiness, not only for organizing such an innovative event, but also for taking up the cause of state proofing as an organizational mission. So thank you, Pete, for that incredible direction that you are driving AfriSACA and AfriBusiness. Thank you for promoting liberty, free markets, commercial justice, and particularly relevant for today, a smaller role for the state. We have heard numerous excellent speakers today explain what state proofing means to them and how to work towards it. I would like to add to this excellent body of thought what state proofing means to me. There is a vitally important characteristic of states and state action that sadly is not universally understood. Now, we know states are territorial monopolists. They claim the sole legal right to initiate force within their territory, subject to constraints depending on a host of socio-cultural economic factors. Now, with this territorial monopoly on force and violence, states do a number of things. But first and foremost, they seek to protect themselves. They seek to survive at all costs. And of course, they do this through numerous ways and means. But as Murray Rothbard, the famous economist and philosopher, argued, these ways and means can broadly be summarized as force and fraud. States use force to survive and fraud to conceal their force. Now, Rothbard did not only mean fraud in the narrow legal sense, but very much in the broadest sense of state undertakings. He meant propaganda, lies, legislative and legal shenanigans. But in addition to this, he meant what I would like to call, for the purposes of this talk, signal distortion. So what is signal distortion? Signal distortion is when states scramble and distort the information we use to make sense of our social environment and to operate effectively within it. Complex economies and social systems are organized by signals: data, prices, wages, sales, costs, competitors' actions, exchange rates, interest rates. All these things are constantly feeding signals to us that guide and motivate our actions. We take these signals for granted, but without them, proper economic planning and coordination are quite simply impossible. These signals are vital precisely because they're produced from the spontaneous order of the marketplace. And so, in a very real sense, they reflect the underlying reality of that marketplace. And that's precisely the reality that needs to be seen and faced up to when conducting all economic affairs. These signals are so important because they're formed from people's voluntary preferences. This in turn allows each of us to respond commercially to these voluntary preferences, to allocate time, resources appropriately, to produce and consume in harmony with one another. States confuse and often destroy these vital signals. And when they do, they can throw the social order into chaos. Now, there are many lessons we can learn from Zimbabwe's experience over the past 30 years, but there are also meta lessons from Zimbabwe, and one particularly important meta lesson is that integral and endemic to Zimbabwe's economic and social collapse was state signal distortion and even state signal destruction. I want to be as clear as possible about this because I think it's so critical. It's not just that the Zimbabwean state stole farmland or printed lots of money, which indeed were hugely damaging, but it's that it radically distorted every important organic signal in the economy to the point where society could not function. The full manifestation of the corrupt, totalitarian thug state is not just violence, theft, and the exertion of control. It's the sowing of mass confusion in the social signals that actually make civilization possible. And so in seeking to understand Zimbabwe's crisis and its lessons for us, and for building state-proof lives, it's imperative to ask, what is real? What signals are confused? What signals may have been destroyed? And how do we rediscover the right signals? Or if you like, the just weight and measure of things. So what are the signals? What are the key signals, and how do states distort them? I would say prices are by far the most important economic signals. Prices consist of consumer prices, input costs, wages, salaries, rent, exchange rates, and very importantly, interest rates as well. States distort these signals in many, many ways. They deliberately create volatile inflation. They enforce price controls to stop prices fluctuating freely in the market. They institute minimum wages. They institute rent controls or even fixed currency exchange rates. States can enforce interest rates, floors, and caps. They can even institute taxes and subsidies which inherently distort price signals. But it's not just when the state decrees that prices must be X or Y or Z, or when it places floors and caps on prices. It's also when it influences prices through its various interventions in the market. States intervene by creating unnatural legislative incentives. They intervene by directing resources using fiscal policy and government borrowing. They intervene using monetary policy and their money printing privileges. State legislative incentives are legendary in their ability to distort signals. I mean, think of the immense social signal distortions created under forced racial segregation policies, or perhaps the great housing market distortions of the early 2000s created by the Clinton and Bush administration's regulatory efforts to artificially boost home ownership. Or how about the distortions created by licensing privileges and professions in the taxi industry and in so many other protected fiefdoms? And then we have the state's ability to tax, to subsidize, to borrow, to spend, and to print money while doing it, which all taken together are a whirlwind of signal distortion. We think of the distorted signals in asset bubbles, booms and busts in subsidized energy sectors, or the vast unstable dependencies that result from state welfare. And what about the immense impact states have on interest rates by being the largest marginal borrower in the economy, or forcing pension funds to buy their bonds through legislation, and lending printed money cheaply to subsidize banks? These have major distortionary implications in the economy. These interventions are not benign because they force the state's vast resources because they use force and the state's vast resources, they're profoundly unnatural and distortive. When states run this kind of interference in the spontaneous order of markets, they scramble signals that we rely upon to make vital decisions. The signals we rely on to help us decide what to buy, what to sell, what to produce, when to produce, where to move, how to invest, all these sorts of things, on and on, are determined by these vital signals that we use. Zimbabwe and its tragic collapse is an archetype of the eventual consequences of unfettered state signal distortion. Extreme money printing and hyperinflation threw price signals into total disarray. Doing business became almost impossible. So what did the state do? To combat wild price fluctuations, they tried to ban price increases. But this just led to devastating shortages. Shop shelves emptied instantly. People tried to rediscover accurate signals by using stable foreign currency, but they were thrown in jail for doing that. And even 8,000% interest rates in the throes of hyperinflation did not protect savers from being wiped out. False signals reigned. But it wasn't just in the darkest hours of its crisis that signal distortion hurt Zimbabwe and its people. The sobering truth really is that the state had been distorting signals for a decade or more before the financial crisis in Zimbabwe hit. You know, the sudden and brutal 75% decline and fall in the value of the Zimbabwe dollar in a single day in November 1997 sparked a decade of calamity for the country, but the truth is that event was at least a decade in the making. A decade of financial system mismanagement and the buildup of national debt incurred from those ever so misguided institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. Those institutions combined with the Zimbabwean state to create a tremendous crisis in 1997. This prior decade, 1987 to 1997, was a decade of signal distortion. Zimbabwe appeared to function relatively normally during this period. The currency weakened, but it didn't collapse. Debt grew, but there was no debt crisis. Inflation rates increased, but they didn't spiral out of control. But underneath the surface, largely hidden from all but the most state-proof people, false signals were leading millions toward an economic calamity. And of course, once that calamity arrived in 1997, rather than immediately allowing real economic signals to re-emerge, the state opted for a strategy of even greater signal distortion. Playing fast and loose with the signals that guide a complex system risks discoordinating human action itself. When states do this, in my view, they eat away at the very fabric of the social order. Quite frankly, state signal distortion is a process of de-civilization. And that is the core message I want to convey to you today. States distort signals. The worst states destroy signals completely. And signal distortion and destruction is a de-civilizing force. Now, South Africans have lived through many years of signal distortion, both under the previous state regime and certainly under the current one, particularly through the last 17 years or so. For the sake of illustration, I want to give an example of chronic signal distortion that eventually manifests as an acute, system-threatening calamity. And that, of course, is Cape Town's water crisis. South Africa's water system is a socialist water system. Government effectively owns the means of raw and reticulated water production, distribution, and selling and pricing. Like any socialist system, the state monopolist cannot make proper market prices. In South Africa's case, this manifests in hopelessly low prices for water. In fact, a lot of urban potable water is completely free to the consumer. South Africans live with a grossly distorted water price signal. We have no proper market price reference, only the administered near-free prices dreamed up by bureaucrats. Well, why is bureaucratic water so cheap? Well, for one, bureaucrats like giving away free goodies for votes. For another, once former bureaucrats have sunk taxpayer funds into infrastructure costs and there are no actual shareholders to deliver a return to, but just an endless stream of taxpayers to continue to fleece, there's no proper cost consideration and profit incentive for the current bureaucrats. With no market pricing mechanism to signal demand intensity and little institutional incentive to invest in new supply capacity, that might allow your rival successor bureaucrat to bask in the glory of its reaping. Prices just don't respond higher to increased scarcity. And when prices are too low and too inflexible, that means shortages. That's just economics 101. But here's where I'm going with this. Cape Town's water crisis is the result of years, and I mean decades, of deception. Whether you want to think of it as social self-deception or a politically perpetrated deception that we all happily went along with, The brutal fact is that socialist water pricing is a grand and fatal lie. A chronic signal distortion. It's not just a mistake or a lack of technocratic judgment or some bad weather forecasts. It's a wholesale, systemic, hardwired political con. And the great con is this, that prices are malleable to bureaucratic fiat without consequence. And it's the kind of con that can sink a system and a society, and came very close to sinking Cape Town. Signal distortion creates fragility. Fragility makes society vulnerable to sudden corrections. This is probably the most important source of what we might call non-linearity or asymmetry when it comes to risk analysis in business and in economics. The Greek debt crisis resulted from immense signal distortion of the euro currency project. The business cycle that all countries experience of booms and then harmful recessions results from the massive signal distortion of central bank money creation and subsidized bank credit expansion. And this causes an overestimation of available savings within society and creates mass clusters of error in the business community. So for me, being state-proof means first, understanding that states can do great damage by distorting the signals that organize complex societies. Both Hayek and von Mises wrote extensively about this. Too few people understand this or even aware of it, and I believe it's something that business leaders need to be acutely aware of as they make strategic decisions about their businesses. We cannot simply take for granted the validity of the signals we observe and use. Second, it means an intellectual and strategic pursuit of signal clarity. If signal distortion is consumption of civilizational capital, then the other side of this coin is that operating with the clearest possible view of reality is absolutely essential to building civilizational capital. And that means that progress, even personal progress, relies foundationally on seeking relentlessly what is real. That means viewing state interventionism far more critically and analyzing which signals could be leading you into greater danger. That in turn means not just protecting yourself from signal distortion, but potentially using it to your advantage too. By better understanding, for example, the business cycle, inflation risks, the likely economic impacts of price controls, or where exchange rate and interest rate risk might be building up outside of plain view. This is important for deploying capital, banking profits, diversifying assets, hedging risk at the right cost. These decisions must at least partly be informed by understanding these signal dynamics. Third, being state-proof means adopting strategies, private voluntary institutional arrangements, exchange and currency networks, leveraging new technologies that fundamentally give rise to a set of signals that are exclusively or largely immune to state signal distortion. This is the endeavor of this conference, to grapple with how we might not only adopt the prudent corporate strategies that Franz Cronje outlined earlier, but go even further to forming, if you like, a parallel institutional universe. It's an ambitious, maybe even audacious plan. It is certainly, as Pete LaRue explained, outside the box, which is perhaps putting it mildly. In a very fundamental sense, it is also, however, difficult. Reimagining and redesigning private institutions from the ground up is no easy task. And it won't be tranquil. We cannot simply expect the survive at all costs state to allow its power and influence to be whittled away and broken without putting up a nasty fight. The more coercive and totalitarian a state's impulses, the more it will seek to engage in signal distortion and suppress the pursuit and discovery of signal clarity. In Zimbabwe, we saw the full spectrum of state malevolence. A weakened state is like a wounded tiger. It must be handled very carefully. Jesus told his disciples to be innocent as doves, but wise as serpents. Is this not the way to approach a state-proof existence? Difficult though it may be, state-proofing our business, and indeed our lives, is a plan worth pursuing. If Zimbabwe teaches us anything, let it be a reminder of the awesome power of the modern state to destroy signals and the potentially great cost of not being state-proof. Our lives, our families, and our communities are far too important to leave at the mercy of the totalitarian state, which is in relentless pursuit of intervention that distorts and destroys the signals that we need in order to thrive. Thank you very much.
Dames en heren, ek gaan een vraag toelaat aan Russell. Baie dankie.
Flip base.
My question relates to the reason why the state is becoming even more totalitarian. And my question is it about the whole issue of equality? Milton Friedman said when equality, with regard to equality of outcomes, is more important than freedom, you end without one of them.
Well, of course, this is a very, very difficult question, as only Flipbase could ask. I think that the theory and philosophy behind why states grow and become malevolent is a very, very vast and difficult topic. Certainly, we can be sure that when ruling elites get lost in their own sense of importance and their own sense of power, and a totalitarian collectivism, if you like, takes hold of the state zeitgeist, well, this is very dangerous. And this is very much, I think, what we're seeing in South Africa, continuing to emerge and bubble up. And I think the totalitarian Leviathan state will dream up all sorts of excuses and reasons to grow. It will distort the meaning of the word equality. It will distort the meaning of the word freedom. It will distort the meaning of the word economic freedom. I said to Flip Base last night, we should not call the EFF the economic freedom fighters, but the economic free stuff fighters. We've got all sorts of rationales that the state creates to grow its power and its influence. But I would say that at core, it's a vision amongst the ruling elites that is, to use Thomas Sowell's parlance, unconstrained. It's unconstrained in its belief in its ability to make people's lives better, to make equality, to remake natural hierarchies. And it's a very, very big problem that we face because these elites believe in this like a cult. And so I think that answer throws into sharp relief precisely why we're gathered here today. To recognize that we may not face the worst case scenario in this country. Things from even within a statist paradigm may turn out okay. They may just about muddle along and we might be okay in that paradigm. But boy, we'd be unwise to hang everything on that kind of outcome. And that's what state-proofing our lives and our businesses, to me, is about. Thanks.